My name is Toby Tobias Kidd, an artist, musician and writer with a particular interest in the public sphere. This is the second episode of my series Public Art and the Economics of Imagination, where I investigate the radical potential of public art by questioning the economic structures that operate behind the scenes. It's made with the support of King's College London, Future Narratives Lab and Art School Plus, as well as Professor Schunbaum of Coventry University. Each episode I speak to an artist or expert who will share their experiences and perspectives to help us to develop a deeper understanding of both the unique opportunities of art in the public realm and its particular issues and complications. Hopefully this will enable us to imagine what a better economics of public art might look like. With me today, I have the artist Michelle Williams Gamaker. Michelle is an artist who makes films to confront the problematic history of cinema, in particular in relation to racial discrimination in what she calls fictional activism. Not so long ago, in 2022, I was really impressed by her film The Bang Straws in Whitechapel Gallery, which I found both meaningful and majestic. She is also one of the founders, along with collaborators Samia Malik and Rahana Zaman, of the Women of Colour Index Reading Group, and works in a number of collaborative partnerships, including the large project A Particular Reality. She has recently installed a major solo exhibition at Dundee Contemporary Arts in Scotland, and I am interested to find out about Michelle's experiences with the funding structures surrounding fine art filmmaking and the relationship between film and public art. Your work is often rooted in retelling stories and repositioning characters of oppression in film history, Hollywood and British cinema in particular. Could you tell us a bit about what you call fictional activism?
Yeah, it's something that's been developing since 2014. It was after I moved back from Amsterdam to London. I think I've been working a lot in collaborative filmmaking, specifically with Mieke Bell, who's a Dutch cultural theorist and filmmaker in her own right. Together, we sort of tackled what I felt were broader, even more universal themes of kind of mental health and gender ideology, migration, questions of what it is to be a migrant individual moving through the world. And somehow, when I got back to London, which is where I was born, it was an interesting one, but I found that I could start writing from this space that felt truer to my experience as a person of colour, but also true to my evident strong love of cinema, which has never really gone away, sort of really, I would say, shapes my identity and my work as a filmmaker. So this intersection created what I called fictional activism. We have to think that this is sort of a retrospective name that I put on it, but what I understood at the time was that I was writing characters who were brown protagonists. That's what was the first term in my mind. And what the brown protagonist was a kind of mutable individual who could kind of shape shift and crucially speak. So a lot of the film stars of the 30s, 40s specifically that I was interested in, they were either disempowered by the fact that they were silent, starring in the background, or had a kind of compromised mode of dialogue because it was from a quite the agency wasn't there, or the kind of creative political drive could not be fully realised because of the politics of the time. So the fictional activism was specifically that, the activist dimension being kind of new political dimension that I was hoping to write, and the fictional being embedding it in the space where it all begins for me as well, and for the characters or the individuals as actors, and that within fiction there's a lot of scope for change, from a space of imagination. So, I fully believe in activism, hardline, straight there. That's a wonderful Madeleine Pledge poster saying join a union, being a union member. But there's also something about how the imagination can inspire and mobilize people.
I wanted to ask about what we would define as public art and sort of what your experience of that is. And I was thinking about how you're interested in films and you work a lot with that, and whether that sort of distribution models to you make it public art, or whether you consider there to be sort of very different sort of areas.
I really am grateful for this question. I do think that moving image film can sit under the kind of broader umbrella of public art. And I think that if we go back to kind of early projects of the 60s and Channel 4, and a much more kind of inventive funding of playwrights and filmmakers and artists that kind of distributed on a kind of more accessible model like television. That probably through kind of having films on repeat as was the way. I think I had access to that as a kind of form of public art or public service through creative art forms. So that, I would agree, at its core, moving image and film can sit comfortably under that. I don't think it's funded that way anymore, so that's more of an issue that we can come back to. But yeah, I absolutely would say that sits under there very easily, or it should do.
Great. I was just making me think, well, maybe this isn't the moment for it, about how that changes with the way that media has gone from a sort of a single broadcast method to the sort of disparate millions of multi-broadcast sort of messy internet world. But I think I'd like to stick a little bit with the sort of public art side and sort of think about like the first times you came in contact with it in a way that you might know it. And again, potentially that is like when you were watching cinema on BBC Two, but also how maybe you might have come across it in a way where you understood it as art.
Absolutely. A work that really hit me, I was actually 17, and it was a Steve McQueen work called Bear, I think it's from 1996. And that was at a show at the Hayward Gallery called Spellbound Art and Film. I can send you the link to it. But
oh yeah, that'd be great.
So it was called Spellbound Art and Film in Britain, and it ran in the spring of 1996. So I was probably doing my A-level at the time. And amazingly, this show had people like Terry Gilliam, Douglas Gordon, Peter Greenaway, Steve McQueen, Paul Arago, Ridley Scott. So it's this funny mix of artists kind of, and Fiona Banner, kind of people writing scripts, making early form features, long form films, and coming across Bear, which is a film with two boxes in a kind of very intimate fight scene, was something that really stayed with me. That whole show stayed with me. It was, I think I went twice to see it, and I don't think I'd seen moving image in that way. I'd seen film on television, I'd seen it within cinema, but this was something that sort of sat in this in-between space. I think Douglas Gordon showed 24 Hours Psycho, which was that kind of expanded 24-hour frame by frame of Psycho, and I loved it.
I was thinking about your progression as an artist, and so coming from seeing the Bear, being like, wow, this is what is this? This is a whole new world opened up to me. So I'm wondering if you could say something about like when you were professionally involved. So stepping forward, it's like, oh, now I'm in that position. I'm making this, and you could tell us about that sort of experience.
Do you mean in terms of my own making or working with other? Okay.
Well, however you consider, like in a sort of a public way, a way that you were considering the way that it relates to people, and maybe potentially it's something where you are working with people, or maybe it's something that you feel the distribution, the way that it's presented, means that it has that kind of a public.
Well, it's interesting. After I graduated from my BA at Middlesex in fine art, I then moved to the Netherlands and went to an academy called the Ateliers. But in between that phase, I spent a long time working as what would be called an education artist at places like Camden Art Centre, the Serpentine, watching other artists accomplish their projects. And my job was always to kind of interpret those shows. And in a way, it was a really useful time of kind of observing and trying to kind of translate that to the public. But then in my mid-20s, I started to kind of work on kind of larger scale documentaries and kind of, longer form fiction works. And I suppose it's an interesting relationship between sort of watching other artists doing it and having a kind of coherency in their practice, and then the moment where you feel that you too step into that kind of mode of making. But that was a process of self-investment because there wasn't any funding, so to speak. So I would often channel my work in teaching at Goldsmiths into, into my practice. So I kept breaking the rhythm of where to be in the world, and also how to define myself. I guess I kind of cut my teeth in kind of making documentary and kind of publicly motivated filmmaking before I moved to fiction, because I wanted, like what was then deemed the kind of ethnographic turn by Hal Foster in arts in the kind of early 2000s, a number of artists kind of had this kind of social dimension to their practice because we were able to just point and shoot our fairly affordable video cameras at the world and make stories with our Final Cut, our humble means of editing. It was just like an easy way to make, and it was the cheapest way to make at the time. And it just meant people had to tell their story, and you had to be able to listen and edit it. And so that was my kind of entry level and most affordable way of making at that point, without being able to kind of like rest in a space of let's say being a painter. I couldn't even begin to imagine how to afford the space, the materials, or even to think that I could do it. That's the sad thing about it, because the irony is being a moving image artist, it costs so much money to make a production, and you are but one person effectively trying to kind of raise for your practice that may involve a number of people that need to be supported. So it's complicated.
You have worked quite a lot in sort of quite important collaborative ways. There's particular reality, but also with a couple of people in a more sort of one-on-one. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's informed you?
Yeah, my whole practice sits within needing to collaborate, enjoying collaboration, because especially my filmmaking ideas cannot come to life without them. But in 2016, 17, I worked with Samia Malik and Rahana Zaman in a Women of Colour Index reading group, which was essentially looking at the archive of Rita Keegan, who is an artist who effectively did something with a huge impact for individuals, black artists, politically black artists, who at the time in kind of like 70s, 80s Britain were either receiving shows in very limited ways or just not receiving kind of their due attention that they deserved. Now at Tate Britain, there's an incredible show called Women in Revolts, which includes many of the artists who are in the Women of Colour Index, which is at Goldsmiths in the special collections in the Women's Art Library. But basically, without Rita's kind of careful documentation of all the kind of ephemera of the time, exhibition ephemera, artist statements, slides, and interviews, some of that legacy would have disappeared. So Rita effectively left individuals like myself, Samia and Rahana, and all the students that were co-studying alongside us, a kind of an insight into, you know, a moment 30 years ago that basically informs a kind of blueprint of our own making today. I'm no longer working alongside them, but it basically kind of filled in a lot of the gaps in my own undergraduate education and postgraduate education. Just didn't tell me that history. Women of Colour Index sort of helped me to kind of see who my forebears were in the London and UK scene at the time. Yeah, I mean, the thing to just say about a particular reality, I think that to me seems very important in the sense that after the time with Women of Colour Index Reading Group, what also became clear as a tutor at Goldsmiths was that students of colour were sort of, this was pre kind of Black Lives Matter and 2020. This was like around 2017. We found tutors across, including colleagues at Kingston, Joe Addison, that we had individuals who were participating in their fine art course, but were somehow either disengaged or felt that they could not speak about their work with a kind of parity with their peers, white peers. And what happened was we started a particular reality to basically forge a network of friendship, really, to sort of stop this kind of feeling of isolation on a course. It's really interesting because I just, in a way, couldn't almost see my colour on my own course 20 years prior. But interestingly, the idea, because the conversation has moved on, we see it, or we feel the disparity more, and yet we were not able to kind of do something about it in the conversations, to kind of have a nuanced conversation about work that maybe engaged with identity. So APR started with that in mind, but it's now developed to incorporate universities of Manchester Met Uni, Kingston was there at the beginning, and Middlesex University and Bath Spa have just joined. And it's effectively becoming a kind of network of undergraduate courses who are also including students from any kind of intersectional background, including kind of thinking about working class students. And sort of the idea is that they can really be involved quite actively in their pedagogy, and there's a lot of space in our curriculum programming for students to kind of put on symposia or develop workshops or showcase their work. And as a result, we're kind of, it's a strong output of activities and developing publications and small film clips of kind of just trying to make the university a more accessible but kind of anti-racist space through pedagogy. And so that's been a really important thing to be part of, alongside just the general part of my practice, which is collaboration as a writer-director on set.
And do you see this as part of your art practice in the same way, or do you see it as a sort of adjunct?
I suppose it's kind of embedded in the art practice, or in at least the part of my practice that thinks about pedagogy. It's a complicated one because if you're a person of colour, somehow there's always a kind of person that looks to you to kind of fix it or answer to the kind of paucity of information or the gap of expressing what the lived reality is. And I think in a way I've set a lot of things in motion, but I also want to really make a claim for just being able to just make and have the kind of creative freedom to get on with that and still deal with the kind of things that are of concern to me within a creative practice. But it's absolutely part of how I make. I couldn't not do it, but there is definitely a side of me now that just absolutely loves realizing projects of the scale that I'm working to, and feeling like there are other ways to be involved in teaching, which in general kind of at the minute sits within visiting tutoring and mentoring other filmmakers and artists. So it's complicated because higher education has just become such a kind of strained space where the academic is now increasingly the administrator and involved in industrial action to try to get, you know, a decent workspace and role within the institution. So it's sort of become difficult based on all that we know about the kind of weight of tuition fees and how that's kind of skewed learning as an experience for the students, so, and for the, you know, for the staff. So I'm looking for other ways to continue pedagogy outside of always being there as an academic. But I can say all of this now because I'm currently on a British Academy fellowship. But of course, when I return at the end of my fellowship, no doubt I'll pick up the wherever it is, I will pick that up. And it's, you know, I speak now from just a little bit of respite from being really on the front line of teaching. But in truth, I needed this break to be able to really immerse myself in making, which is something that I've never really given myself permission to do, because I always thought that becoming an artist, just never, for me to be an artist, I never took for granted the idea that for me it was an incredibly privileged job to have. I couldn't quite. I think I always felt some kind of guilt around the fact that it was such a pleasurable way to live, and therefore I probably connected to my South Asian roots, had to have pedagogy alongside it, had to kind of get my PhD, be able to teach in HE, work, you know, as an artist delivering education and workshops, also with places like Tate, and just, you know, I did my time in a way to be able to kind of offset what I felt was the luxury of being an artist. Now, of course, I take that all back, because I don't think being an artist is a luxury. I believe it to be a fundamental role in society. I think artists have a really important role to play. And if I have any, you know, fight in me, it would be to kind of work maybe at policy level to try to kind of make whichever government we have understand the absolute vital nature of an arts curriculum from primary, secondary into HE, that is not an add-on and is an integral part of how we think about learning. You know, I can't bear the fact that it remains this kind of thing that you can do if you want to. It's not embedded as a, you know, the fundamental component that you have of reading, writing, arithmetic, science, all of the modes of English. It needs to be part of that as a core structure. But yeah, I'm learning. If I have any more say or sway, that would be something that would be of interest to me. It's like, how can we do more for young people, thinking about how art can be applied to their lives, really.
I think that I would like to ask you a little bit about, because I think you touched on it here with a couple of bits where you were talking about you're on this this year doing this fellowship, was it? And then I was thinking about how this leads to me thinking about the sort of funding structures that you might have come across for doing different kind of projects, and essentially like what have you found to be difficulties and what things have worked really well?
So yeah, when I should just clarify that the thing that I'm on is the British Academy Wolfson Fellowship. It's actually more than a year. It's almost unheard of. It's a 3-year teaching buyout, which basically raises money for me to leave my post and raises money for a colleague to replace me. So that's why there can be this exchange. And it gives me a little bit of money across the 3 years to fund the research that said that I wanted to do across the 3 years. But so it was actually a process of writing for my life to buy myself out of teaching, because I knew I had my first major institutional solo at South London Gallery. And that writing was basically to say, I must do all these things that I would like to do, but it meant kind of, I don't know, really finding a way to kind of make the claim for, at the time with the British Academy, was to say, I don't see a drop down for arts and film here in your, list. And really we need to kind of, this gap needs to be identified, because the work that I seek to do, embeds film histories, thinks about kind of race and discrimination, and wants to do so through kind of creative vessels, through filmmaking. And that was absolutely accepted as something. But again, it requires people to believe that the practice-based model of academic research is as justified as kind of quantitative modes of research, or, the kind of STEM approach to study. So that's that thing. Then when I came back in 2014 to the UK, I realised that, my flitting back and forth between mainland Europe and the UK had not done my career any good, and that whatever small footholds I had in my early 20s was sort of for nothing. And I had to start again, which meant, rebuilding a film crew, self-investing, finding really scant pots of money, really. The only thing I can say is that it was through some form of self-belief and personal hardship and putting myself in debt to begin making. And even there's a kind of privilege to say, okay, I'll funnel a bit of my earnings in. Some people don't even have that. But without that self-investment, effectively what you could call, how people might say, getting a personal loan or investing in your business, that self-belief was the only thing that I had. And of course, making films that hopefully would be received as good films. But, those sorts of things, I had to do it because I realised nobody was going to fund me. I'd gone to Film London, I tried at the BFI, and effectively the answer is this is all very interesting, but there's no money, or do come back again at some point. So for moving image artists, we are in a very competitive space. There's excellent filmmakers out there. Having just, part of the judging process of Film London's Jarman Award, it's humbling, because many of those individuals nominated are my peers, and they're making outstanding work. Some of that funded, but most of it not. And we're all effectively competing against one another for really small pots of money. It's just, I've just got to this phase, in my mid-40s, where it's sort of my time to get some of that investment, but that will also fade, and somebody else will rightfully pick up the spotlight and take their time. But it really is, it feels like a holding pattern, and it's not a fair model of distribution in terms of funding. I wish that there were actually smaller pots of money available, almost like a kind of bursary or stipend for artists. That was the model in the Netherlands when I was there, a government fund, quite generous at the time, of I think it was about €32,000 across 3 to 4 years to spend on your practice, almost like a salary. And of course, you could spend that in any way you wanted, on your rent, on your making, on your studio. That stipend enabled a kind of flourishing for artists in their mid-20s to be able to stay as creative practitioners. And we tend to kind of lose artists once they leave their undergraduate, because the reality of life kicks in and you have to just pay the bills. We have a very skewed economy in the arts where you effectively work free or volunteer, you volunteer your time, or you accept the kind of unspeakable of just, you're not going to actually ask for a fee, are you? You accept really bad labor practice, because getting a show, you should be grateful that you've got some time in a show.
If you could imagine an ideal situation, how do you think it might work if you could get involved more in the political aspects and talking to whoever's in power about trying to make those changes? What would be, say, the way? Where would you come from? Where would you start with these things?
Yeah, going back to this idea of arts being embedded properly, fairly, and equitably within education, but then also post that moment, how can the artist have a more integrated role in society? Like, how could we have artists in panels across industries? Artists within town planning, artists within any mode of business, just being part of life. Like, it should be the way we sort of breathe, is that the artist just doesn't seem maligned but is really integrated. But that's a whole sea change of thinking. But it means there could be, if we were thinking a kind of universal pay for all, couldn't there be universal pay for artists to kind of do their work? Because for years, artists have been embedded within communities, working with young people, working with adults, working with students of all ages, involved in public programming, involved in making change, which we sort of see on Instagram and online. They are there on panels with a lot of wonderful things to say. So it's just that somehow I don't still see a kind of fair exchange for the labour that is offered by artists, often freely. So that seems to me, if we could kind of improve the way that artists are understood from a social dimension, but I don't think that that's sustainable, and I don't think it's fair that I might siphon my production money that's meant, or my artist fee, into my production. Like, there's production money, and then there's money that an institution might say that's earmarked as your fee, which of course can't ever cover the amount of hours you put into something. But even with something like Thieves, this is no fault of the institution. The costs of moving image are so high that money also got put into production. So I'm not paid. And similarly, artists still aren't fairly remunerated for what they do. And they do things in really micro, kind of like a micro political way, where it's hard to kind of note the kind of meaningful exchanges that take place, one-on-one social exchanges. But they're doing it, and they're doing things that are probably difficult to sustain, because whatever funding there is has a kind of time limit on it. But across the board, I've had many wonderful experiences as an artist, kind of working in community groups, and they're sort of, you make a difference in the moment, but there's no sustained way to keep that support presently. But if there was something like a kind of universal pay for artists, that would be something of interest to me, because that would mean that maybe more people would understand a kind of pathway of progression for an artist outside of study.
I wanted to ask what you think is missing, and then just for you to talk about what you've got coming up. What I'm interested in is, like, if you've got it, potentially you don't, but if you think that in the sort of public art space or in the funding space, there is stuff that isn't being able to be realized because of the way that funding operates or economics of the art world. And then, yeah, if you could sort of finish off with letting us know about where we can come and see your work.
Sure, no worries. I think, I mean, I over the years, I've sort of seen that whatever space we had for experimentation is kind of dwindling because things have to have a kind of output. Or if you look at Arts Council funding, one of the kind of core things that you need to respond to is the idea of audiences and participation. It seems more important for funders to know how many people will experience and encounter the work over quality of work or over an artist really developing practice. I have a kind of rider on that is that there was, of course, things like developing your creative practice in the Arts Council, which offers £10,000 to a younger artist to really explore their practice. So there are spaces for experimentation without major outputs. But when you look at project grants, you can't really get funding unless you basically can evidence how the public will receive the work. If we could kind of shift that and towards more of a focus on experimentation, knowing that that will have a positive trickle-down effect for the individuals and communities involved in that project, without output being only measured through who encounters it as a numerical thing, that would be so much more valuable. I should just say what I'm up to next is that I'm about to, if I can make this new film called Strange Evidence, it would be the final part of a trilogy that I'm calling Critical Affection, which includes the Bangstraws, which you saw at the Whitechapel, Thieves, which was at South London Gallery and is currently in Dundee Contemporary Arts, and moving to Bluecoat in Liverpool. Strange Evidence will open at Matt's Gallery first as a film set, a kind of physical film set that the public can walk into with moving image elements. And then during the course of the show, it would be my hope that I would film the film, and in 2025 I would edit that film, and that would be the last part of this trilogy that I'm calling Critical Affection, which continues to look at marginalized film stars and basically has a kind of span of thinking about fictional activism, fictional revenge, and this final component is fictional healing, looking at the story of Mel Oberon, who was South Asian, Anglo-Indian, but had a huge career as a leading lady, but she did so because she passed as white her whole life and took that secret with her to the grave. So I'm looking at Anna May Wong, Sabu, and Mel Oberon, and the different ways in which the industry kind of worked with them, used them, and how they kind of live within very kind of limited creative conditions. So that's what I'll be doing, but the funding is still the challenge.
And thanks to Michelle Williams Gamaker. It was wonderful to speak with her and to learn about the intricacies and the depth in her work, her experiences and ideas. I found the embedded acts of collaboration and pedagogical practice really interesting, and this conversation starts to build a clearer picture of the kinds of economics involved in making art. I hope you enjoyed our second episode, and I will see you next time on Public Art and the Economics of Imagination, where I speak to the philosopher Colette Olive to help us in defining what we mean when we talk about this thing called public art.